Hej och välkomna till detta specialavsnitt av studie Anekdot som ska handla om den unika relationen mellan Sverige och USA. Åtminstone sedan den stora utvandringen på 1800-talet har det funnits ett särskilt band mellan svenskar och amerikaner. Vi svenskar konsumerar amerikansk kultur som få andra, och mer än en gång under 1900-talet har det varnats för vad svallvågorna av en amerikansk fulkultur gör med svenskarnas språk och kulturvanor. Hur uppstod egentligen svenskarnas hatkärlek till allt amerikanskt? Är vår relation till det amerikanska starkare eller svagare idag än vad det varit förut? Och hur är det med bilden av Sverige i USA? Har den rent av förändrats drastiskt bara under de senaste åren? Vi bjöd in Nordamerikaforskaren Blanck och konstkuratorn Obniski för att prata om allt detta. Samtalet spelades in på engelska framför publik på House of Sweden i Washington i samarbete med den svenska ambassaden och i anslutning till den pågående utställningen Faraway So Close. So could you please begin by telling us some things about yourself? Monica, who are you?
Sure. I'm a first-generation American of Polish descent, and I'm a museum curator and a design historian, and I think the reason why I was invited to be in conversation with these wonderful people is because I've spent the better part of the last 8+ years working on an exhibition that looks at the design exchanges between the Nordic countries and America.
And Dag, who are you?
Hello, Blanck is my name, and I'm a Swede, but I spend a considerable time every year in the United States. And I have a dual appointment at Uppsala University as a professor of North American Studies, but I also work at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, in the American Midwest, where there's an Archives and Research Institute for Swedish-American relations. And I have spent my academic career studying different types of relations between Sweden and the United States, and images and disimages, if you may use that word, of each other.
Perfect. So we're going to start by having 10-minute presentations, one first by Dag and then one by Monica to kind of set the stage. So Dag, what is your presentation going to involve?
Well, looking across the Atlantic, images of Sweden and the United States in the 20th century, how the two countries have perceived each other. And there you see the Statue of Liberty wrapped in a Swedish flag. Two key terms I will be talking about, two M words, migration and modernity. And I think if you want to try to understand the relationship between Sweden and the US in the 20th century, those factors, those words are important. So M&M. And I'll start by saying something about the migration. That was an enormously large Swedish migration to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, as there was from Europe in general. In relative terms, Ireland had the highest out-migration, of course, but then came Norway and Sweden. So they were affected, Sweden was affected greatly by the migration. And almost all Swedes have relatives in America today. So the migration, this large migration of Swedes, over sometimes it's estimated that perhaps between a fourth of the Swedish population lived in the United States by 1910. And they went to the farms of the Middle West that you see to the left there on the picture, but they also went to the industries in the United States, the large growing industrial areas. They were that's what drew people here. Here are some numbers, and what I want you to look at is the right column there, 0.1 it says after 1850, and 42.0 after 2020. What that suggests, the numbers there are the number of Swedes and Swedish Americans in the United States at different points in time, according to the US Census. They're measured a little differently. Sometimes they're immigrants, sometimes they're immigrants and their parents, and from 1980, people who identify as being of Swedish background. And the third column, though, is the percentage of Swedes or Swedish Americans in the United States in relationship to Swedes in Sweden. So in 1850, the Swedish American population in the US was 0.1% of the Swedish population in Sweden. In 1910, the Swedish American population in the US was 25% of the population in Sweden. So you see how important the migration had become. And when you start from 1980, the US Census Bureau asked the so-called ancestry question, where you ask, what is your background, regardless of how many generations back it is. Then you end up with numbers like 42%. The Swedish-American population constitutes 42% of the Swedish population. It's a way to use the numbers to illustrate the closeness and the consequences of this migration. You can play this game with other nationalities too. For the Norwegians, it's even higher. And for the Irish, we don't even want to talk about, the Irish are something like 30 million Americans self-identify as Irish Americans, and there are 5 million people living in Ireland here. So, but it just goes to suggest the significance of the migration here and in shaping relations between two countries. And the consequences of the migration was, first, a Swedish America, the kind of ethnic community that was created here in the United States. Cultural identity, religious identity, social identities, organizations, an organized version of Sweden in America. There was also, very important, a return. All migration creates a return flow. And quite a few, maybe 20% of all the migrants who did come from Sweden to the United States went back after a shorter or longer period of time. And they brought with them all kinds of things, not just individuals, but ideas, goods, money, and so forth. So kind of an America was created in Sweden through these returnees. And it all created a high awareness of each other on both sides of the Atlantic. And then when the United States enters the world stage after World War II, for example, becomes the dominant superpower in the Western side, the ground has been prepared in Sweden, you could say, through this migration. Many, many, many contacts already exist. And the relationship becomes even closer as a consequence of the migration. So that's the first M word. The second M word is modernity. And from the 1930s and on, modern Sweden is formed. The people's home, folkhemmet, the Swedish model, all these terms that catapult Sweden into kind of international fame, at least we think so, as a model for the rest of the world. And there are all kinds of dimensions of that. You see, for example, furniture design that Monica will talk about. There's the World's Fair, the New York's World's Fair in 1939, the Swedish Pavilion, which created got enormous attention, with a horse in front of it, a dollar horse. There was a big discussion, should there be a folkloristic horse in this modern setting? Swedish furniture, the Nixon-Kennedy debate here, Monica will talk about that. Look at the chairs. That's Scandinavian design. You know, here you have the first presidential debate. And what do they sit on? They sit on Scandinavian, in this case Danish, I must admit. But nevertheless, that's how prominent it had become, the modernity. Also, culture, film. Another way of describing the Swedish-American relationship could be the 3 S's: sex, socialism, and suicide. That would be the American view of Sweden. And here we have one of the S's, Summer with Monica, as it was called in Sweden. Monica, the story of a bad girl, it was sometimes called here in America also. That is a very outspoken, sexually liberated film. Today it would be nothing, but in those days you saw a woman swim naked and together with her boyfriend, and that was very daring, very risque. And American censorship agencies were quite interested in this film, and it was delayed when it came to America. Marcus Child's very important book, Sweden, the Middle Way, from 1936, is very important here. He was a New Dealer. He was a journalist, a well-known journalist, and connected to the New Deal, and traveled to Sweden to study what Sweden was doing to fight the Depression. In 1932, the Social Democrats win the election in Sweden, start building the modern Sweden. 1932, FDR wins the American election. And there's a parallel here between what is being done in Sweden and what is being done in America. And they influence each other. And this book became a bestseller. Yale University Press, I I'm sure they didn't think it would be a bestseller, but it really gave Sweden this reputation of being the ultra-modern country and the country that solved so many problems. And here is what FDR said when he, at a press conference in 1936, he said, I was tremendously interested in what they had done in Scandinavia along those lines in trying to fight the depression in social reform. In Sweden, for example, you have a royal family and a socialist government and a capitalist system, all working happily side by side. This middle way between capitalism and communism, the compromise, the Swedish compromise. But there's also Sweden as a bad example. It wasn't all happy times. The conservatives in the United States eventually started criticizing what Sweden had done. It was a strong state, large public sector. And to the left, you can see an article from the front page of Dagens Nyheter, the leading Stockholm newspaper, where President Eisenhower in 1960 in Chicago talked about Sweden as a bad example. He warned, don't go the Swedish route, because all kinds of bad things will happen then. Namely, suicide. Sweden had the highest degree of suicide, the highest suicide rate in the world, he said. You can discuss those statistics many times, but he said it, and that stuck. The idea that this Swedish solution, the strong Swedish state here, if you go that route, you will get high suicide rates in your country. So stay away from that. Also alcoholism, and he mentioned. So from the conservative side, Sweden was sometimes used as a warning example. And if you remember, that was in 1960, and in 2017, President Trump also made a reference to Sweden. You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden, how can you? And it had to do with immigration. Of course, for President Trump, immigration was a big issue, and he argued that all kinds of problems in Sweden were due to the massive immigration to Sweden. It wasn't clear that anything had happened last night in Sweden. People were looking around, what is he talking about? There was no particular event. But yeah, I think it was more the larger question of immigration. Other modernities, American modernities, made their way to Sweden. Skyscrapers, architecture, skyskrapare. To the left you see the Kungstornen in Stockholm from 1925, the first skyscrapers built in Stockholm. In a very clear American context. They refer, the newspapers write that they are more American than the American skyscrapers. If you go up to the top floor where there was a restaurant in one of them, you can sit there in the restaurant, you can see farther than you do in New York. You know, so that is American modernity. I mean, the skyscrapers, clearly you see them in many European countries. And here, Wenner-Gren Center, which is at the end of Sveavägen in Stockholm, which was built in 1962. One of the Stockholm doesn't really have very many skyscrapers, but Wenner-Gren was described also in very American terms when it was opened. It's today, it was all from the beginning and still today used as a hotel partly for visiting researchers at the universities in Stockholm. And it was modernity there was American research. The American universities, Sweden entered into a covenant with the future here. They was described by bringing American scholars to Sweden and by linking Sweden to the modern world of scholarship. One newspaper also describes the first celebration of Halloween in Sweden, probably in 1962, when children of the American visiting scholars dressed up in costumes and looked like ghosts that we had never heard of that in Sweden. Spökfest i Forskarborgen, ghost party in the researcher's castle was the headline in Svenska Dagbladet. But that modernity, academic modernity and science is also very part. And consumerism becomes very important. Here is an ad from 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭𝐢𝐜𝐚, the large Stockholm department store, from 1946, when they had a special exhibition or a special event called Klart California, Ready for California. And here's a description of the first blue jeans, when the first blue jeans came to Sweden. A long awaited, these peppy long pants in incredibly durable, specially woven blue cotton, denim jeans, and then you get the pronunciation here, have the inimitable American fit in the waist. No wonder they are the favorites with cowboys. There's a very strong association. So you have all kinds of, consumer products and so forth that McDonald's, this is the first McDonald's that came to Stockholm in 1970. And McDonald's, when it started expanding abroad outside the US, Sweden was a very early market. A small market and a test market, I think one could say it became. And American popular culture in general, of course, massive. New films in 2016, 41% of all the new films that opened in 2016 were from the US, 17 from Sweden. 8 of the 10 most seen films were from the United States. And there you can also see Donald Duck that is shown on Swedish Christmas Eve. But also the critique, amerikansk skräpkultur sköljer över oss. American garbage culture just floods over us. So popular culture is obviously a very important aspect of this relationship. But also we could, and I will end now, but we could also say, you mentioned ABBA here, there's also a kind of a return, not as much, but there's a return of Swedish popular culture, Avicii and ABBA, and today music, especially the music industry, where Sweden, popular music, where Sweden plays a big role.
Thank you, Doug. Just for sake of comparison, do we know exactly how tall the 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭𝐢𝐜𝐚𝐧𝐭𝐬 are?
They're not very tall, but they were tall for their time.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
For being Sweden.
Oh yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
they're like,
Yeah.
I wouldn't estimate, but they're like 1/10 of any skyscraper.
Yes, or
20 stories or something.
20 stories, yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. And we'll move on straight to you, Monica.
So I'm here to talk about this exhibition that that it has been a privilege to be a part of, called Scandinavian Design in the United States, 1890 to 1980. I worked on it with a colleague, and I'm just showing you my colleague here, Bobby Tigerman at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. I worked on this show while I was at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and we conceived of this exhibition together alongside our colleagues in Norway and Sweden. And this is the first exhibition to explore the under-examined question of why there was an extensive design exchange between the Nordic countries. And we looked at Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, and the American design communities across the 20th century, and how this conversation really shaped American design. And I'm showing you this wonderful side because we're in the House of Sweden, and I also wanted to let you know that we dug deep and did a lot of research across the Atlantic, and so we had the great privilege of going to the 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭𝐢𝐜𝐚 Museum as part of this research. It's also opened in lots of places thus far, and it opened in the National Museum in Stockholm in October of 2001, and then it went to Oslo, where it was also at the National Museum. It just opened in Los Angeles, and so for any of you that have plans to go there, it's there until the beginning of February before it comes to the Milwaukee Art Museum in March of 2023. And I also just want to note to everyone that even though we are looking at design exchanges across all the Nordic countries, I have chosen some slides that are very Swedish-leaning, despite the parameters of the exhibition, because of course we're in the House of Sweden. And so I just want to take everyone through the kind of 6 themes that comprise the show. And again, we'll see some kind of overlap between what Doug was saying. So the first theme is migration and heritage. And so in this section, we explore how Scandinavian immigrants and their descendants made these myriad contributions to artistic and cultural life in their adopted communities. And Doug went through all of the statistics, but it's really confounding when you think about how many Scandinavians were in America. And there are all sorts of different statistics, but one that we kind of clung to was that by 1920 there were over 2 million Scandinavians across the United States, and they were doing all sorts of things like. And I'm showing you here on the screen this chair by Green and Green. Green and Green is the most important California arts and crafts architecture firm. But they had Swedish craftspeople making their things for them, which is supremely important to remember. So these skilled craftspeople came over, kind of used their knowledge in various ways. Some of them adapted their techniques. Some of them found new ways of expressing themselves. And others really created kind of new forms for their new nation. We're also really interested in this idea of cultural performing, and so the Dala horses are perhaps a way of thinking about that. And you're seeing here, the same image from a different perspective. But this is, I think it's really interesting to think about how Sweden wanted to represent themselves, and to choose this is, says volumes. The second section that we look at is something that we're calling Selling the Scandinavian Dream. And this examines how the image of Scandinavia was sold to American consumers. And we say this because they're kind of evoking the parallel myth of the American dream, this idea that consumer capitalism can lead to class mobility and a better quality of life. So this idealized version of Scandinavia was sold to American consumers through a variety of ways, right? Through retail settings, through advertisements, and I'm showing you, again, on the screen, this House Beautiful is kind of one of these pieces of evidence, a way of kind of selling this dream to Americans. We're also interested in exploring how the marketing of Scandinavian design exploited a variety of recently debunked stereotypes and myths. So Scandinavian design has historically been associated with organic design, with natural materials, with being handcrafted. And of course, we know that that's not entirely true, that there's more to it than just that. So we're interested in kind of obscuring this myth, if you will. Another theme that we look at is design for diplomacy. And so in this section, we look at how nations have long used design and architecture to advance their political goals. And this is done through this kind of soft power of cultural propaganda. This is done through national pavilions at world's fairs. It's done through the construction of domestic architecture like embassies in various places. It's also done through museum exhibitions. And I'm just showing you some examples of Swedish glass and then the American glass that is directly inspired by this Swedish glass. But probably the greatest example of design for diplomacy is the United Nations. And it's really emblematic of this Cold War diplomacy. And it is so important that the three most important spaces within the United Nations, the three council chambers, were given over to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. This speaks volumes. And we could not have asked for a better package when we were doing this exhibition. And well, we'll get to the chair debate if we get to the chair debate later, but that is also a kind of prime example of design for diplomacy. Another section that we look at is this idea of teachers and students, and so we see how Scandinavian designers and craftspeople taught in American schools and really ultimately shaped the course of American design. One of the great centers here in the United States was a place called Cranbrook. It's outside of Detroit. It is by no means the only place, but it is a place that was really very important in our story. And I'm showing you just a variety of things that come out of Cranbrook. So Lillian Holm, a Swedish weaver who spends decades in Michigan. This is a great tapestry that she makes, first sight of New York. It's fabulous. The 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐿𝐻 on the right. 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐿𝐻 was one of the band of Nordic instructors that the Saarinens brought over from various places to teach these American students. And the chairs I'm showing you on the left are just another kind of great example. So Eero Saarinen's chair is on the bottom, and it's directly inspired by a chair that was designed by Carl Malmsten, who that chair would have been brought over by 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐿𝐻 and was in his home there. And so you could see a young Eero Saarinen, the son of Eliel, who was also a Cranbrook student, going to dinner at the 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐿𝐻's home and being obviously very inspired by this work. And so he created this design for Kingswood School, which is one of the schools on the Cranbrook's campus. So this is just a very, a small kind of sampling of these stories. Another big idea is this idea of travel abroad, which is also something that this exhibition that we're sitting in takes into account. But in our exhibition, we look at, throughout the 20th century, how Americans and Scandinavians studied with, they taught, they exchanged knowledge with their international counterparts through these kind of formal academic programs, through apprenticeships, through travel fellowships, and also independent work abroad. But what was most important was that these were all temporary stays, right? This was not permanent migration. And these transnational networks and the personal relationships that were formed were critical to the spread of ideas, this kind of sense of collaboration, and the realization of many different design projects. The final section that we look at is something called Design for Social Change. And this explores the emergence of consumer and environmental critiques by some designers in the United States and many more designers in the Nordic countries who were thinking critically about their work. They were envisioning a new role for design within society. And this was really beginning during the turbulent time of this kind of political and social upheaval of the late 1960s. And in many cases, Americans and Scandinavians partnered on design and advocacy projects that they could, raise awareness and show how design could address some of these systemic problems, things like the planet's dwindling resources, overconsumption, excessive waste, physical barriers to access, right? All of these topics that we're still dealing with today. And on the screen, I'm just showing you again some Swedish examples with the Maria Bengtsson on the right. But also, it's again, we could not have written this better if we had asked for it. The fact that Victor Papanek's Design for the Real World, which as an Austrian American writing this book, the fact that it was published first in Sweden in 1970, that a Swedish publisher gave him the space and creativity to kind of put his work out into the world, was not lost on us. And then, of course, the English version came out a year later. So I'm going to end by just saying that there's a beautiful book that explores all of these topics and then some, and that's it.
Thank you, Monica. I thought I'd begin by asking you, what caused you to become so interested today in the Scandinavian design? Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. I will say for me, it goes back to graduate school. I took a class, I remember this very, very distinctly, with a professor at graduate school, and this was in New York in 2005, and she taught a course on 20th century Swedish architecture and design, and I was just taken from that point on. I just thought it was the most fabulous thing ever. And one of the things that this professor did was she also was really interested in kind of setting up, because we were in America, seeing whether there were any parallels between the two places. So then fast forward to it's 2014 when Bobby and I started working on this project together. It was really, again, for me, it was kind of going back to that early kind of graduate school foundation, and then realizing that, oh, wait, this story has not been told in any sort of holistic way.
So was it primarily an aesthetic kind of interest in the type of design and architecture, or were you also interested in the sort of cultural development, or maybe also political development across this period?
Yeah, probably less so about politics. I think the designs speak for themselves, and as a design historian and curator, I'm most drawn to that. But I also, because all of my projects have very kind of social leaning emphasis, in doing kind of deep research, you realize that, oh no, I mean, there's a reason why these things look the way they do. And I'm so glad you brought up the middle way in your presentation, and just the fact that these things were being read in the United States, about kind of learning about Swedish socialism and the kind of political systems. But yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that answers it a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Dag is, as you may or may not know, the most famous Americanist in Sweden. As soon as something happens in America that isn't perhaps directly political, but has something to do with culture in any kind of way, both the television and radio calls Dag. So he knows his stuff. And Dag, I just wonder, like, you've devoted your whole career really to the US or to the Sweden-American relation. Why?
That's a good question. No, I think I must say, because I received a scholarship to go and study in the United States. You pointed to the enormous importance of these travel, academic exchanges, and so forth. And I was a relatively young person, age 18, And like so many, you go to America to go to college for a year. My mom said you should do this, and I was myself somewhat, well, I don't know, I've been marching to the US Embassy and protesting various things, but I followed my mother's advice. I was dutiful. So I came, and I had an enormously positive experience at the Liberal Arts College in Illinois, Augustana College, with which I'm still associated. And they kind of opened my eyes to a very different way of learning and so forth. And I learned an enormous amount about the United States and about Sweden and America. And then I came home and continued. And as I get older and you look back to roads never taken or roads taken, I can see had I not gotten that scholarship from the Augustana and the Sweden-America Foundation, I would have done something entirely different in my life. I don't know exactly what, but that is the beginnings of it.
Yeah. Wasn't there also, I mean, we were talking about the conceptions about Sweden in the US and vice versa. Wasn't there also a very Swedish dish that you had?
Well, when I came to the Augustana, this college founded by Swedish immigrants with a strong Swedish identity still, I was invited to a Christmas lunch by an organization, a Swedish-American organization, 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭𝐢𝐜𝐚𝐧𝐭𝐬. And I was the Swedish exchange student that year. So, oh, well, thank you very much, very nice. And they brought out the food. Herring, sill, nice. Köttbullar, meatballs, yes. But then came what they were waiting for, the pièce de résistance, potatiskorv, potato sausage. And I had never heard of that. I was a suburban boy from Stockholm. And they were eagerly awaiting its arrival. And here it is. Okay, it looked like a sausage of some kind that came out, potatoes. So I ate it, of course, and they looked at me and said, was it just like your mother's? And then I understood I had to tell a white lie, and I said, yes, it was. Oh, good. We did it the right way. And I said, what is this sausage that they think is the most Swedish thing there is that I, a Swede, have never heard of? And that led me into investigating the differences between what happens with an ethnic culture when it's removed from the homeland and it takes on a life of its own. Now, there is potatiskorv in Sweden also. It's a regional dish. So many people from Värmland who had emigrated brought with this tradition. I had never seen it. But it does show, like Arnold Barton, the historian, wrote a very interesting book called The Folk Divided, about Sweden and the United States. There's a folk, people, that is divided by the migration. And there's one on the American side of the Atlantic, and there's one on the European side of the Atlantic. And they are related, of course, and they sometimes speak the same language, but they develop in different directions. Here, of course, they're influenced by American society. And so it's I think that's very interesting. I think you see that in all migration situations, as a matter of fact. The Swedish migration, the Swedish Americans can become an example of what happens when you migrate, which I think is very interesting to study. Migration is such a powerful force in human history.
Monica, when you spent time in Scandinavia and in Sweden, did you experience anything similar in that you were presented with something typically American that you didn't really recognize?
No, but that's also because I did not want to go into like a McDonald's or any other sort of American type place. With this project, we were very fortunate to be able to go to Sweden multiple times, actually, in doing the kind of research and development. And every single time when we would meet with colleagues or professors, and we would, ask them to have a meal, we would say, like, and please, can we go to like a Swedish place? Which, because for us, of course, we were coming from here, and so we would want to have the, I hate the word authentic, but, we would want to have that sort of experience as opposed to.
Of course, but so what did you eat? I didn't know we had Swedish restaurants in Sweden, anyway.
I mean, well, I guess they're, well, yes, right. I mean, they wouldn't be called Swedish restaurants. They would just be called your regular restaurant. So what did I have? I had, well, I love herring because I've already said I'm of Polish extraction. So I love any sort of smoked fish. Lots of meat. There was lots of meat and potatoes. Yep. Meatballs. Yeah.
All the Christmas foods, basically, or what we eat at any holiday, actually.
Well, and also because I have never been to Sweden in the summer months either. I've always been when it has been really cold. So like November and sorry,
terrible choice.
Well. We knew that people would be there instead of being on holiday. It was also, November or February. So, yeah.
So that, you must come in June sometimes.
One of these days.
Completely different. Dag, why are Swedes so obsessed with the US?
That's a good question. There is an intense interest in the United States, in Sweden, clearly. Maybe an obsession. It has to do with many things, I think. One is this migration factor, that these ties are very strong, that they were established very early, and they still endure in some sense. You can talk about the kind of long-lasting consequences of the migration. The migration is over, has been over for a century now, but we still see the effects of it. So that's one factor. Another factor, of course, is that the United States is such a dominant country in the world. It's a very asymmetrical relationship, as I think you said yourself. We know much more about the United States than the United States knows about Sweden. There's a selective understanding. So that's another factor. And I also think that these two combine to make Sweden very interesting. There are studies asking people, if you had to emigrate, if you wanted to, have you been thinking about emigrating? Yes, say a number of people. Okay, where? What's your destination? The United States comes very high on the Swedish list before many European countries, maybe in second place. Maybe, before Italy, before Germany. And so the kind of Swedish cultural map, a mental map, I should say, the US is very, very close there. And I think once this tradition was established through the migration and through the interest in, both countries see themselves as very modern. I've been to America and I've seen the future. That's the kind of modernity. And I could hear Swedish architects who've been to Vällingby, the suburb of Stockholm, where these modern buildings were being created. I've been to Vällingby and I've seen the future. So that they resonate with each other. And once these relationships have been established, they are very strong and they endure.
Monica, I'm thinking of this asymmetrical relationship. When you've been working with these projects and also the exhibitions, have you come across, what kind of reactions have you had from Americans? Are they curious because Sweden is, they have very specific ideas about what Sweden is, or is it because they don't really know if it's Sweden or Switzerland?
That's it.
Thought so.
It's really disheartening, I think, is probably the right word. But when we were telling people that we were working on this project, Scandinavian Design project, which I should probably do a little asterisk here because this is a learned audience, and we all know, and I kind of oscillate between saying the Nordic countries and Scandinavian design. I will get back to your question, Frida, in just a second. But we decided to use this turn of phrase, Scandinavian design, because it had cultural currency, because Americans know what Scandinavian design is, even though they might not be able to place where Sweden and Norway are or where Denmark is, et cetera. So, and we know that Finland is technically not part of Scandinavia, but again, as part of, because Americans lumped all these countries together starting in the mid-century, we were just going to be able to, I don't know, play on that kind of cultural currency and use that turn of phrase. So to go back to answering your question, it's interesting because I don't really think that people can distinguish between places. And to kind of push it a little bit further, and I don't know if I should, but I think for Americans, this kind of idea of there being a unity between all these countries, when again, we all know that a Dane is not a Swede, is not a Finn, is not, every country has their own kind of interests, history, politics, culture, society. But again, for Americans, there is this kind of unity among a group of people that is not really so similar. I mean, some parts are similar,
Right.
but yeah.
We might have a bit of a similar, like the other way around as well. We talk about Americans.
Right.
I mean, it's not like
That's right.
America is so easily sort of narrowed down to one particular type of
That's right.
cliche.
I mean, if you were to, a New Yorker, might be offended if you thought that they were not from New York and from Miami or something like that. I mean, I think the same kinds of identity, right? Because that's really wrapped up in identity, in issues of identity. Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of how the image of America and Sweden, how these relations have changed. Not the relations perhaps so much as the image or the idea of how these relations. Well, you mentioned, for example, like the New Deal. There have been periods where Sweden has been seen as some sort of either ideal or a scary socialist type of place. And how can you? Is there a simple way of sketching some sort of curve in how when these relations have been seen as more positive or negative than others?
Well, I think the 1930s was a time when the modern Sweden starts emerging in the Marcus Child's book. 1930s and then the 1950s became a high tide for Sweden in America, I think. And then there is a reaction. There's always a reaction, and the reaction comes with Eisenhower's speech there about, no, don't go the Swedish way because it will lead to suicide and so forth. Then, of course, political relations also. The Vietnam War created a big problem for Sweden and the United States when Sweden became very critical of the American war in Southeast Asia. And that resulted in severe diplomatic problems. There was diplomatic relations were almost broken off. Not quite, but almost. There was no Swedish ambassador in the United States, and there was no American ambassador in Stockholm. And it wasn't until 1976 really that relations were restored in full. So political events also have shaped relations on those sides. I think today, if you look at the cultural relations, as I mentioned, the Swedish music industry that I'm not super familiar with, but is now an example of Swedish cultural flows towards the United States. There have been always less of that. We have some examples, film, Bergman, and so forth, in certain selected parts of the United States became very big. But I think now we see on a larger scale in the music industry, in particular, Sweden playing a very important role in California. And American musicians coming to Sweden, to studios in Sweden, working with Swedish producers there. So I don't know if that was an answer to your question, but I think politics sometimes are important and create problems. Then you have cultural relations, and then you have the kind of social image of each other, where Sweden has benefited from this American interest. Marcus Child's book not only placed Sweden in a favorable light in the U.S., but also worldwide.
That was published in so many languages.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, that really helped Sweden gain this. And even if you remember here in the U.S. during the debates about President Obama's healthcare reform, Obamacare there, those who were against it pointed to first Canada as a bad example, but then Sweden. And what's his name, Jon Stewart from The Daily Show even sent a team of journalists over to Sweden. He was in favor of it, and interviewed people on the street. Well, we understand that you are suffering here. You have long vacations and you have health care, and it's a pretty terrible place you're suffering from. Oh no, we like it. We get along. We're not unhappy. So I mean, these images they come back, and they are resilient. I should say.
Monica, do you have something to say about this, and perhaps also where, like, the American view of Sweden in particular, when it was at its height or at its low point?
You know, the mid-century is really the height. Whether it's, again, the UN and 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭𝐢𝐜𝐚𝐧𝐭𝐬 being in charge of that, the Economic Chamber Council, with Marianne Richter's, you know, curtains, like, you know, having a kind of splashy, diplomatic kind of space, again, on the international stage, right, because this is the United Nations, or whether it's, you know, museum exhibitions, and again, I'm thinking of the Design in Scandinavia exhibition, which was sponsored by all of the Nordic countries. These governments kind of came together and really supported this exhibition, this multi-venue exhibition that traveled to, and at one point I remembered exactly how many, but it's like 12 or 13 different cities. It would just, you know, go on the road, and the idea was to show, you know, to show the kind of splendor of what is a Scandinavian design. Again, to go back to, we were not distinguishing that this was Danish and this was Swedish at that point, but yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the high point of Sweden in the United States, it was certainly in the mid-century. And the low point, I don't know, in terms of architecture and design.
Maybe there never was one.
I don't, you know, honestly, I'm hard pressed to come up with one.
That's good. That's good. You both mentioned in your presentations this the question of traveling abroad in various ways. Is there why was that, Monica? Why was that such an important dimension of the exhibition?
Oh my gosh! I mean, I think it was one of the places where we were able to uncover more names that hadn't been known before, right? So in our field, you know, someone like, I've just mentioned 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭𝐢𝐜𝐚𝐧𝐭𝐬, kind of architects, right? Oliver Aalto, these people kind of who had come to the United States at various points. Those stories were already known, but it was when we started digging a little bit deeper and finding, you know, one of the slides I showed was an example of a weaver. Again, I'm going to butcher her name, Bittan Wahlberg. She studied at the Kunstfach and then came to New York, and she spent about 5 years in New York City, and it's remarkable because she made connections to Dorothy Liebes, who was one of the most important textile impresarios in the United States at that time. She also had several exhibitions at various museums in New York, and then she handmade things, right, for these museum exhibitions, but then she was also able to make connections to industry in the United States. So her designs were being produced by actually a place that I now live in Georgia, which is the carpet capital of the United States, is in Dalton, Georgia, and a Swedish woman was designing carpets for this carpet capital of the United States and applying very American names to them, right? Something was called circus, something was called, again, things that she would have seen on her travels around the US. And then she went back to Sweden and continued her life. But in the process of doing this exhibition, we uncovered so many stories like that, which would have been just I mean, she was a footnote somewhere else, because how else were we, you know, going to find her? But through the process of kind of research and finding objects and digging a little bit more, we were able to kind of shine light on some of these craftspeople and designers who just spent a short amount of time here, but I think were really impactful. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Have you had have Vikings ever featured in any of your exhibitions or work?
Well, Vikings, so yes, we had to include Vikings in this exhibition because it's part of the American imagination of Scandinavia, right? I mean, it's also, so I worked on this exhibition while I was at the Milwaukee Art Museum, which is 90 miles north of Chicago. And in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition, Norway, which was still under Sweden at that time, they put together I think it was a 9th century replica of a Viking ship that they built and then sailed across the Atlantic and then went through the various canals to come down to Chicago. And this was a moment. I mean, reading the newspaper accounts from the Chicago Tribune and the various other newspapers in and around Chicago, it wasn't just Norwegians or Swedes, Danes were also, I mean, again, the kind of Nordic people writ large were extremely proud that, that this had come over from their homeland. And so we had to find a way to include some of this material in the exhibition. The Viking ship still exists at the Field Museum in Chicago. We went to go see it. We thought we were going to include it in the exhibition. We ended up not doing that for lots of reasons. But instead, there are a number of decorative objects from the early 20th century that various houses in the United States would make, whether it's a little silver centerpiece or pieces of jewelry. Many designers were fascinated by this Viking material. And it was only, well, I shouldn't say it was only after, but it was during a convening. We had a convening in which we brought scholars over from the various countries. And we met to discuss the themes of the exhibition, the checklist, et cetera. And it was at that moment when there was a little bit of there was a heated debate about Vikings. And I'm going to let Dag take over from here because I think he can speak more to why that, why that would have been a debate.
Yeah. Well, what is your take on
well, no, that's very interesting because the Vikings became such a prominent feature for the immigrants in the United States as the immigrants sought to find a home here and to stake a place in the American social fabric. Early presence is very important, right? To be the first thing, so to speak, to show that you have, and for Swedes, for example, the New Sweden colony on the Delaware has been very important. A small Swedish colony there in the 17th century. But very early, only 20 years after the Mayflower, there were Swedes there. It was ultimately a failure, but for Swedish-Americans in the 19th century became very important to show that the Swedes were early. And the Vikings, the Icelandic sagas, the stories about the landings in Vinland, as it was called, which we now know as Newfoundland, where there have been excavations, and we know that there were settlements there, not lasting for any more than a couple of years, and certainly not in Minnesota, where there's a fake runestone that is claimed dated to 1362, but that's a fake. So the Vikings play an enormously important role to show an early presence, and the Columbian Exposition was very important in making that claim. In Scandinavia, and especially after World War II, the Vikings become problematic because of the use of Viking history and Viking lore in Germany during the war. So they are toned down in Scandinavia, in Sweden, for example, and also in Sweden. When I grew up, we were internationalists, not nationalists. When I was in 5th grade or 6th grade, we would assemble in the schoolyard once a year and in front of a flagpole and watch a flag being hoisted. And it was not on June the 6th, which is the Swedish National Day. It was not the Swedish flag that was being hoisted and which we saluted. It was on October the 24th. And what day is that, I ask you? And what flag maybe... it was the UN Day, United Nations Day. So we saluted the United Nations. We were internationalists, not national. So nationalism was at the low point. This is in the late 60s, early 70s. So and the Vikings become so strongly associated with that. So we still don't have these huge Viking museums that many Americans, Swedish-Americans and Scandinavian Americans come. They expect it. Norway does have it, and it's beautiful. The on Big Day, the 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭𝐢𝐜𝐚𝐧𝐭𝐬 ship, yeah. Well, but so there you have two clear trajectories here, and of course today we have Vikings in popular culture,
right?
Which is viewed in Sweden as well, and in America. With Swedish actor, the Skarsgård brothers, that's their little special niche there to play Vikings in every conceivable way, it seems.
Well, I think actually a Viking museum has just, or is just about to open up in Stockholm.
Yes,
so we gave in the end.
In recent years,
yeah.
yes, in recent years, certainly that is true.
It's changed.
But for a long time, it was a difficult topic in Scandinavia, not so much in the United States.
No, not in the United States at all, which is why, again, when we had this conversation about how, and again, it's just the perception, right? And it's about how this imagery is now linked to kind of a white supremacist discourse, and so while Americans may not understand that, I think they're actually beginning to understand that even more now that after January 6th, with many of the kind of nationalist groups that are erupting all over the United States, and some of them have even taken on some of this Viking imagery. So it's yeah.
And if I may add, it's also clear that the Swedish government, Sweden, of course, wanted to present itself as a modern country.
Right.
It was modernity. And then the battle over the horses, the dollar horse. Should there be a dollar horse in front of the World's Fair building in 39 in New York? Eventually, they agreed that yes. But is it the folkloristic image that we're presenting, or is it the modern image we're presenting?
But it's so interesting that Sweden decided to do that, because it was precisely because they chose those folkloristic objects that Harper's Bazaar did a huge fashion shoot, Vogue showed up, so choosing to do that as opposed to just having a kind of, strict glass and steel sort of, really added a dimension that I think, again, gave Sweden a little bit more distinction than some of the other nations there.
Right.
So speaking of Vikings, do you, Monica, see other cliches, the Swedish cliches about Sweden in the US? What are we like, according to you?
What are Swedes like in the United States? I think, well, okay, so if I'm thinking through the lens of this exhibition, which is the right lens for me to think through, it's the image of the dollar horse on the one hand, and then it's the image, there was this great advertisement for baby Bjorn that features a very attractive young couple with their with their dog, a child, and they're walking through this grand forest. And so what does that say about Sweden? Well, this is what they look like. They're family-oriented. They're always in nature. And so I think those are the kinds of images and ideas about Sweden that had been circulating, at least, Bjorn is 70s onward. And then, the dollar horse also, because of this kind of connection back to a cultural heritage that, stems for hundreds of years. And I think that is something that's easier for Americans to kind of hook into, as opposed to, I don't know, something more modern, I think.
Yes, social programs or.
Well, that's not an image, right? That's
true.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's quite an interesting tension, I think, between, on the one hand, this, you were talking about sex and socialism and suicide, this sort of idea. I also read and wrote something about how one explanation some American journalist had of
why Sweden was associated with sex was because we had such poor socialist conditions that the only fun we could have really was to have sex. So that was his explanation. And I'm thinking of that kind of image where Sweden is associated with some sort of oppressive, cold, dark place, very close to Russia, etc. And then on the other hand, what you just mentioned, Monica, this very sort of healthy, equal, sort of green and sweet place somehow. Doug, do you have anything to say about those sort of contrasting or they're related also.
Well, but they coexist. I think that's the point we should make. And then there are different interests that want to advance some of them. There's the official Swedish interest in marketing Sweden as innovation and green and so forth. But I think that both coexist. There is this darker view also of Sweden that Bergman's films is one example of that, and so I think we can see both, and that's the same thing about America in Sweden. The Swedish view of the United States, there are two optimistic and negative, more pessimistic views of the United States that coexist, and the relationship between them may vary over time. But again, these are once these images have been established, I think they are durable. I mean, they endure in some cases. It's a variation on a theme here that comes. I think that in case of the United States and Sweden, it's the European, as a general European view of America that goes back to the colonial times and the first accounts of what is happening in the New World. And you can find a long continuity in these views, both the positive and the negative views.
Could you elaborate a little bit on those two views? What is the positive?
Well, I mean, first, the positive view would be in Sweden, for example, America as the opportunity, the land of opportunity. Freedom and democracy would be an important factor there too. And consumerism eventually, that there's an enormous wealth that is being generated here. You saw the blue jeans and so forth. Whereas the negative side would be materialistic, that it's a country that is so focused on material things and an unappreciation of culture. 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐿𝐻𝐬𝐻𝐼, a Swedish author who spent time in Hollywood, many have come over and he hoped to make it and be a writer in Hollywood. It didn't work out at all, so he had to go home. Others stayed and were more successful. But Bergman came home and wrote an article about amerikansk okultur, American unculture. That is, that America lacked culture. It's a short history, and so forth. This young, brash, and that has a long European tradition of that, of anti-Americanism. I mean, cultural anti-Americanism that dismisses the United States. Even Jefferson had to notes on the state of Virginia as in part a response to Europeans who claimed that the nature in America was so horrible that certain animals, dogs, could not bark in America because the climate was so oppressive and warm and humid. So Jefferson said, no, dogs do bark in America. He wrote back that this is to France, there was French observers and his relation. And he even sent a moose. He had a moose transported, Jefferson, to Paris to show that these animals did exist in America. You can imagine what that took to have it. It was not live, but the dead moose was shipped when he was ambassador to show, yes, we do. So because
animals survive even in America.
Yeah. So we are not subordinate in some sense to.
Well, these kinds of strange encounters and differences are. I mean, we've talked about cliches and talked also about the more elaborate views of each other. And both of you have academic training and have worked a lot with these relations. Would it be possible for you to say something about the differences in, like, say, the more scholarly work and differences in between how we see Sweden and America and the more sort of what everyday conceptions?
Well, I think there's a gap between popular conception, popular ideas, and academic understanding, obviously. We hope that the academic understanding is more thorough, perhaps, or more problematizing or raising issues and questions. I think the more popular understanding, we in Sweden, I think, we are so influenced by the United States, flooded with American images and the United States. But I think we have still a very selective understanding of the United States, even though we think we know so much, and we do know a lot. It's a selective understanding. I see it in my students, for example. They asked during the Obama years, they were very surprised that he did not campaign to end the death penalty, because he was very popular, and Swedish students felt very close to the United States. They, read.
Why that topic?
But the death penalty for them was just so strange. And I said, no, Obama is not going to make that an issue in his campaign. But why is that? Well, you don't win elections on that. So there is an example, and there are many other examples too, of we think that we are so close to the U.S., therefore the United States must be similar. Yes, it is, but it is also quite different. So our understanding is selective. And that's the argument for having American studies in Sweden that we make with the university.
Perfect, you got to see.
If you want to understand you ignore it at your peril. It's a very important country. So if we want to understand this country, let's study it systematically, so to speak, and have observers and newspaper writers and authors write about the United States.
Yeah. Well, and the parallel, of course, is Scandinavian studies in the United States, right?
Exactly.
Which there are a handful of programs. I knew the one at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Yes.
But I think, as we've talked about before, those programs tend to be full of ethnographers and kind of, again, looking, and historians, and looking at kind of a history of Scandinavia, as it were, as opposed to maybe more kind of contemporary culture. Now, granted, there are professors in various places that are doing some of that material, but it feels like a little bit different than what American studies is like in Sweden.
Perhaps. But I think your point is right, that there is an academic community on both sides that study in the U.S., that studies Scandinavia, and in Scandinavia or in Sweden that studies the U.S. And there is an exchange of ideas going on there and understanding. And then you have the general popular image, which is partly rooted in the academic knowledge that is being generated, but is also derives from other sources of information.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that it's probably not linked to the university at all. I think it's linked more to popular, whether it's magazines or television or the radio. I mean, that's,
I overestimate our importance.
Well, to kind of approach the present and the conclusion to our conversation as well, I mean, thinking my experience of Scandinavian studies departments is that they're very interested in Strindberg, August Strindberg, our famous writer, but also in Nordic noir, which has become a very successful genre across, I think, both Europe and the US. But my final question to both of you is this, looking across the Atlantic business, where are we with this today? I'm thinking both the US and Sweden, especially recently, have changed quite a bit, not least in terms of political sort of radicalization. So how do you see these conceptions of Sweden and America changing in the future?
Oh boy.
A tiny question for you to
handle. That's a really loaded question. I guess when I think of Sweden, I think of one of the S's, socialism. And I don't know, I'm less heartened by the kind of direction that things are going in right now. especially around kind of the political arena. And I think when politicians ascribe a certain way of thinking and being to a place like Sweden, as you know, from thinking back to Doug's slides earlier, that it can be a little bit negative because it's just, I don't know, we're not getting the full picture, we're not getting the whole history, we're just getting like snippets. And I realize that my answer is not making a lot of sense, but it's also partly because of the time that we're living in which we don't really have a lot of, you know, people just kind of look at their news on Twitter or, you know, get kind of snippets here and there, maybe not fact-check things, maybe not understand that the kind of messages that are being put out by media sources, I mean, and this ties back to our kind of large discussion around image making and how those kinds of images might be truthful in some way, but are also constructions, right? So I've gone a really, really long way, and I'm not answering your question at all, but I am.
I think maybe what you're saying perhaps also is that it used to be easier, maybe not because it was actually more truthful, but when we had, I'm thinking in Sweden, when we had 2 TV channels and we saw cowboy films in the afternoons, I mean, then it was quite easy to have an image of US, even if it was extremely limited. And I imagine that the reverse as well, that it used to be easier to have an image of Sweden.
I mean, I think the contemporary moment, and it's also part of the reason why we stopped our exhibition at 1980, is because globalization changes things, national identity. I mean, you made this point earlier about your International Day versus National Day, right? I mean, kind of identity, the kind of identity politics around who you are gets very, very complicated. So yeah, I think I agree with you 100%. There isn't just the American wearing a cowboy hat. There's now the American, and you can fill in a million blanks.
And what about you, Doug? What do you think? What will be the image of Sweden without socialism? I mean,
it's still there. I think it's an important part. But I agree with you. It's a much more complex. And as an historian, I am always reluctant to make predictions about the future, or you know, the old question that Zhou Enlai, the Chinese communist leader, was asked, "Sir, what are the effects of the French Revolution?" Well, it's still too early to say, he said in the 1960s. So a little bit like that. But there are probably, I think that your point there about 1980, something may have happened then. There are shifts. Perhaps there are shifts going on right now in both countries that might be still too early to say where things are going. But it may be that we are in somewhat of a new phase here on both sides of the Atlantic. And some of the older images are perhaps not as strong as they used to be.
Not as well.
That could be. I leave that open. Still too early to say.
Too early to say. And speaking of a new phase, you said things can change, and maybe that's a good kind of place to end. So I wanted to thank all of you who came here tonight, and I want to thank all those of you who have been following us behind your screens. And most of all, of course, I want to thank Doug and Monica for coming here and having this great conversation with us.
Thank you. Thank you.